At its height, the Soviet Union ran more than 40 cities that did not officially exist. They had populations in the tens of thousands. They had schools, cinemas, hospitals and bus routes. But they did not appear on any published map. They had no name beyond a postal code and a number, and the people who lived in them were forbidden from telling anyone where they were. These were the closed cities of the Eastern Bloc, the secret settlements behind the Iron Curtain, built for coal, for uranium, for radar, and for weapons. The rest of the world was not supposed to know existed. What nobody knew on either side of that curtain was how many of these places would simply be switched off. When the money ran out, when the war came, when the empire that built them dissolved overnight, the order went out to leave. And the people left. We found 10 of them. Subscribe and stay with us through to number 1. On a vanishing island in the Aral Sea sits a town called Kantubek, where Soviet scientists buried up to 200 tons of weaponized anthrax in 1988 and then walked away. We start at the top of the count with number 10. Number 10. Halmer-Yu, in the Komi Republic of Arctic Russia. There is no road to Halmer-Yu. To reach it, you cross 70 kilometers of open tundra northeast of the mining city of Vorkuta, and at the end of it, you find the broken shell of a town the Russian state has used for target practice. The name comes from the Nenets language, and it means roughly river in the valley of death. The reindeer herders buried their dead here long before anyone went looking for coal. The coal was found in the early 1940s, when the Soviet Union had lost the Donbass to the German advance and needed a new source of coke for its industry. Industrial mining began in 1957. A proper town grew up around the mine, with a hospital, a library, 2 kindergartens, a music school, and a house of culture, all of it built on permafrost at the edge of the Arctic. At its peak, around 7,000 people lived there. But the seams were thin, and the mine was never truly profitable. In 1993, Moscow decided to close it. By 1995, the town was being emptied by force. Riot police were sent in, doors were broken down, and the last residents were loaded onto railway carriages and taken away. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the army moved in and turned the dead town into a bombing range. In 2005, a strategic bomber fired cruise missiles into the old House of Culture, with the President of Russia watching from on board. Halmer-Yu was not abandoned so much as demolished in slow motion by its own country. The next town was not bombed. It was simply cut off from the world and left to argue about who it belonged to. Number 9. Akarmara, in the hills above Tukvacheli, Abkhazia. Drive up the valley from the coal town of Tukvacheli, and the apartment blocks of Akarmara rise out of the forest like a row of broken teeth, balconies hanging open, fig trees pushing through the floors. 40 years ago, this was a thriving Soviet mining suburb. Today, the official count is around 35 residents. Tukvacheli was granted town status in 1942, built in large part by German prisoners of war to mine the coal the Soviet war effort badly needed. The settlements around it, Akarmara among them, housed the miners and their families. In the 1970s, the wider town held more than 20,000 people. But Abkhazia sits on one of the great fault lines of the collapsing Soviet Empire. When the war between Georgia and Abkhazia broke out in 1992, Tukvacheli was besieged for more than 400 days. The mines closed, the factories stopped. And when the fighting ended, there was almost nothing to come back for. The population fell by something close to 4/5. What is left in Akarmara now is one of the most complete abandoned places in the Caucasus. kept company by a handful of elderly residents who never left, an old woman selling honey by the roadside, and the forest doing the rest. The mine that built it is silent. The blocks it filled are open to the weather. But this next one was not built to dig anything out of the ground. It was built to watch the sky. Number 8. Skrunda 1 in western Latvia. Skrunda 1 does not appear on the road signs even now. The nearest town, Skrunda, is real and ordinary. The number 1 was the secret version, a closed military settlement hidden in the pine forest a few kilometers away, sealed behind a perimeter, and built around 2 enormous radar arrays pointed at the west. It went up in 1963. At its height, around 5,000 Soviet soldiers and 1,000 civilians lived inside the wire, with their own schools, shops and barracks, entirely cut off from the Latvian countryside around them. The radars were part of the Soviet early warning system, the network designed to spot an incoming American missile while there was still time to respond. When Latvia regained its independence, it wanted the radars gone. A deal was struck, and in 1995, the half-built newer array was brought down with explosives in a controlled demolition watched by international observers. The last Russian troops left in 1998, taking what they could and stripping the rest. This is where the story takes a turn that is almost funny. The Latvian government, with no use for a secret Soviet town, eventually put it up for auction. Skrunda 1, a complete settlement of tower blocks and bunkers, sold to a private buyer for around €12,000, less than the price of a second-hand car. The buyer never developed it. The blocks still stand in the trees, stripped and silent, a Cold War listening post nobody quite knows what to do with. Number 7. Paldiski, on the coast of Estonia. If a radar town sounds secretive, the next place ran on something far more dangerous. Paldiski is a port town with a long history, but for nearly 40 years it had a second identity no outsider was allowed to see. From the 1960s, the Soviet Navy ran its nuclear submarine training center here, and the town around it was closed. Estonians could not enter their own coastal settlement without a permit. The place effectively belonged to Moscow. At the heart of it sat 2 land-based nuclear reactors, installed inside a vast concrete training hall so that submarine crews could practice on a working reactor without going to sea. Thousands of sailors passed through. The town that served them was Russian-speaking, military, and entirely sealed off from the country it stood in. Estonia became independent in 1991, but the reactors and the men who ran them did not leave at once. The last Russian troops finally pulled out in 1995, and only then did Estonia get its town back. The reactors were shut down and their cores sealed inside a steel and concrete sarcophagus that still sits on the headland. Paldiski is not a ghost town today. People live there, but walk to the edge of it and you find the sealed reactor building on the shore, a grey block containing the buried heart of a Soviet submarine fleet sitting quietly above the Baltic. It is the kind of inheritance no town asks for. If you are finding these worth your time, take a moment to subscribe, because there is a closed city like this for nearly every republic the Soviet Union left behind, and we are working through them. We will reach the most dangerous place on this entire list shortly. First, number 6, and the furthest north of them all. Number 6. Pyramiden, on the Arctic island of Spitsbergen. This one is Soviet through and through, and yet it never stood on Soviet soil. Pyramiden sits on Svalbard, the Norwegian archipelago high in the Arctic Ocean, where a century-old treaty lets other nations run mines on Norwegian land. The Soviet Union took full advantage. It built a complete model town here, named after the pyramid-shaped mountain above it, and ran it as a showpiece of Soviet life at the top of the world. Sweden founded the settlement in 1910 and sold it to the Soviet Union in 1927. At its peak, around 1,000 people lived there, mining coal and living rather better than most citizens back home. There was a swimming pool, a sports hall, a cultural centre with a grand piano shipped in by sea, and a bust of Lenin that remains the most northerly statue of him anywhere on Earth. But the coal was poor and the mine lost money for years. In 1998, the decision came to close it. The miners packed up over a single season, boarded a ship, and left almost everything behind. Because Svalbard is so cold and so dry, Pyramiden has barely decayed. The Lenin bust still stares down the empty main street. The piano still sits in the cultural centre. Polar bears wander between the blocks, and a handful of staff keep a small hotel open for the few who make the journey. It is a Soviet town preserved by the Arctic, kept almost exactly as it was left. Number 5. Mologa, in the Yaroslavl region of Russia, or rather beneath it. Mologa is not abandoned, it is drowned. Where the town once stood, there is now the surface of the Rybinsk Reservoir, one of the largest artificial lakes in the world, and the old streets lie around 20 meters down. The town was old, first recorded in the 12th century, and for hundreds of years it was a prosperous trading post on the Volga, host to one of the great fairs of medieval Russia. By 1940, it had around 6,000 residents, 900 buildings, a monastery, and a market square lined with shops. Then Stalin ordered a dam. The plan for the Rybinsk Reservoir originally spared Mologa, but engineers raised the water level by a few extra meters to increase the power station's output, and that decision put the whole town under. The flooding began in 1941 and took years to complete. Most residents were moved to the nearby city of Rybinsk, their wooden houses dismantled and floated downstream. 294 people refused to leave at all. According to the account that survives, they stayed in their homes as the water rose. The number 294 is carved into the memorial at Rybinsk to this day. Every few years, when drought drops the reservoir, the streets of Mologa rise back into the air, and the descendants of the old residents come out by boat to walk on what is left. The next place was hidden, not underwater, but inside a forest, and it was listening to the stars. Number 4. Irbene, known by its code name Zvyozdokka, the Little Star, in the forests of western Latvia. Deep in the woods near the Baltic coast stands a 32-meter radio telescope, a vast white dish on a concrete tower, surrounded by the ruins of a town the Soviet Union built to operate it in total secrecy. Irbene was a closed military settlement, off every map, where engineers used the dish to intercept Western communications and track signals across the Cold War sky. The town had apartment blocks, a school, shops, the usual furniture of Soviet life, all of it hidden among the pines and known only to the people inside. The Great Dish was the whole reason the town existed. When the Soviet Union fell and Latvia became independent, the army was ordered out. The real question is what they did on the way. Before the troops left in 1993, they tried to wreck the telescope they were leaving behind, pouring acid into the bearings and damaging the mechanism so it could never be used. They very nearly succeeded. But Latvian scientists took the dish over, repaired it, and turned the spy instrument into a working radio astronomy observatory that studies the sun and deep space to this day. The town around it was never repaired, so you have a strange double image. A functioning telescope, listening to the universe, ringed by the gutted blocks of the secret town built to keep it hidden. If a town built around a telescope sounds like the strangest thing the Soviet Union buried in a forest, hold that thought. The last two places on this list were built to hide things far worse than an antenna. Number 3. Pripyat, in northern Ukraine. This is the one you have probably heard of, and it earns its place anyway. Pripyat was a brand new city, founded in 1970 to house the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power station and their families. It was meant to be a model of the Soviet future, young, modern and optimistic. With an average resident age of around 26, nearly 50,000 people lived there. There was a hospital, a cinema, swimming pools, and a brand new fairground due to open for the May Day holiday. On the 26th of April, 1986, reactor number 4 exploded a few kilometers away. The authorities said nothing for a day and a half, while the city carried on, children playing outside under a sky full of radiation. The evacuation came on the 27th of April. Residents were told they would be gone for 3 days and to pack lightly. They never came back. Remember those 40 cities that did not officially exist? Pripyat was not one of them. It existed on the map, in the brochures, as a showpiece. It was the secrecy after the disaster that turned it into a ghost. Today, it sits inside the exclusion zone, the fairground wheel still standing, never having turned for the public, the blocks slowly going back to forest. It is the most visited abandoned city on this list, and still one of the most unsettling. But most people who know Pripyat have never heard of the secret city hidden in the woods right beside it. Number 2. Chernobyl 2. A few kilometers from Pripyat, and far harder to find. While the world watched Pripyat, there was a second settlement nearby that did not appear on any Soviet map at all, marked on the few documents that mentioned it as a children's holiday camp. Chernobyl 2 was the home of the people who operated the Duga, an over-the-horizon radar so enormous it became known in the West as the Russian woodpecker, for the tapping sound it pushed across the world's radio frequencies. The radar is the thing you see first, a wall of steel antennas, nearly half a kilometer long and 150 meters high, rising out of the forest like something left by a vanished civilization. The town that served it held the engineers and soldiers who kept it running, sworn to secrecy, officially non-existent. Then, reactor number 4 exploded next door. Chernobyl 2 sat well inside the contamination zone, and within days, the secret town was evacuated along with everything else. The radar was switched off. The people left. A vast installation that had taken years to build was simply abandoned where it stood. The woodpecker still towers over the trees inside the exclusion zone, too large and too radioactive to remove. It listened for an American attack that never came, and now it listens to nothing at all. Number 1. Kantubek, on Vozrozhdenia Island in the Aral Sea. Of every secret place the Soviet Union left behind, this is the one the rest of the world should most hope stays buried. Vozrozhdenia was once a genuine island, far out in the Aral Sea, between what is now Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Its isolation was the point. In 1948, Stalin's government chose it for a top-secret biological weapons facility, and the laboratories went up at the southern end of the island. At the northern end, they built a town for the scientists, the soldiers, and their families. They called it Kantubek. Around 1,500 people lived there, with a school, shops, a cafeteria, and a parade ground. All of it built around work that no one was allowed to name. In 1954, the site was expanded and given the designation Aralsk 7. For the next 4 decades, Soviet scientists used the open ground at the heart of the island to test the deadliest pathogens known to humanity. They worked with anthrax, plague, smallpox, tularemia, and brucellosis, releasing them into the air over tethered animals and measuring how they died. In 1971, a field test of weaponized smallpox is believed to have drifted to a research ship and then to the mainland town of Aralsk, where it killed 3 people. The outbreak was covered up for 30 years. Then the empire began to fall. By the late 1980s, the Aral Sea was shrinking fast, drained by Soviet irrigation, and the island was getting closer to the mainland every year. That terrified the people who knew what was buried there. In 1988, in a hurry, they trucked up to 200 tons of weaponized anthrax slurry to the island and dumped it into pits. Then, in 1992, they closed the laboratory, evacuated Kantubek, and left. Here is the part that should keep you awake. The sea kept shrinking, and in the early 2000s, Vozrozhdenia stopped being an island at all. It joined the mainland. Whatever was buried out there was now connected by dry land to the rest of Central Asia. In 2002, an American team spent 3 months on the island, neutralizing what they could of the anthrax pits. But scientists who tested the soil found spores that had survived the heat, the burial, and the disinfectant. Kantubek itself was demolished a few years ago. The town is gone. The island is gone. What remains is an empty stretch of poisoned desert that used to be unreachable and no longer is, holding the residue of the worst things a government ever tried to build. Of all the doors the Soviet Union locked behind it, this is the one nobody should ever open. There are towns on this list the Soviet Union built to dig coal and abandoned when the coal ran out. There are towns it built to watch the sky and walked away from when there was no longer anyone to watch. And there are towns it built to hide things, then buried, then ran from when its own empire dissolved beneath it. 10 of them today, and they are only a fraction. The Soviet Union left behind hundreds of these places, scattered from the Arctic to the Aral, most of them still standing, most of them still off the maps that replaced the ones they were never on. The coal towns will crumble, the radar towns will rust, but the thing buried on Vozrozhdenia will outlast all of it, because anthrax spores can survive in the ground for the better part of a century, and nobody is entirely sure how much is still down there. That is what the Iron Curtain really left behind. Not a wall, but a map full of holes. Subscribe, and we will find the next 10 together.